This is lecture 56B in the ABCs of Communism series, which will be in volume 3, the chapter that details all of this material. And this lecture 56B is on the feudal stage in Korea. And last time we left off with the continuing farmer revolts during the slave period in Korea. And these revolts continued, forcing the ruling classes of the Korean peninsula to modify their form of slavery to feudalism. Now, the first of the new kingdoms to be so restructured was Balhae, spelled B-L-H-A-E. In AD 698, Joseon founded Balhae only 30 years after Goguryeo had fallen. Balhae occupied the northern part of the former lands of Goguryeo and controlled the northern areas of the Korean peninsula. It also took over much of Manchuria, except for the Liaodong Peninsula. Its expansion took present-day Russian Pryorsky Krai under its aegis. Now, Balhae styled itself as Goguryeo successor kingdom and the inheritor of Goguryeo culture. However, in practice, it had adopted Chinese governmental structure. It was a time of relative peace and stability in East Asia, and Balhae flourished. Balhae was weakened as a polity by the internecine reappearance of bourgeois versus landed nobility class struggle. In AD 926, Balhae was conquered by the Khitan Liao dynasty. Now, large numbers of refugees, including De Guangheon, the last crown prince of Balhae, were welcomed by Goryeo. De Guangheon was included in the imperial family of Wangjeon, bringing a national reunification between the two successor nations at Goguryeo. However, no historical records for Balhae have survived, and the Liao net left no histories of Balhae. So, while Goguryeo absorbed some Balhae territory and received Balhae refugees, it compiled no known histories of Balhae either. So, the Samguk Sagi, or History of the Three Kingdoms, for instance, includes passages on Balhae, but does not include a dynastic history of Balhae. The AD 1700s Joseon Dynasty historian Yu Duk-gong advocated the proper study of Balhae as part of Korean history, and he coined the term North and South States period to refer to this era. Now we come to the later three kingdoms that existed between AD 900 and 936, consisting of Silla, Hubakji, and Taebong. Were next, and they to reach a servitude-labor compromise. Among them, the last two were established when Silla declined in its power. They officially claimed to be the heirs to Bakji and Goguryeo. Now, Taebong, or later Goguryeo, was originally led by Gung-yi, a Buddhist monk who founded later Goguryeo. Gung-yi was actually a son of King Gyeomun of Silla. When Gung-yi was born, there was an omen that he would be a cause of Silla's downfall, and thus Gyeomun ordered his newborn to be killed. However, Gung-yi's nurse ran away with him and raised him in secret. Now, it's easier for a slave or a nurse or a person in servitude in Korea to run away than it would be for, say, a black person in North America, because all he had to do was to go to town someplace and meld in with the population. The unpopular Gung-yi was deposed by Wangjeon in 918. Wangjeon was popular with his people, and he decided to unite the entire peninsula under one government while he could. So he attacked Bakji in AD 934 and received the surrender of Silla in the following year, and in AD 936 he conquered Hubakji. His regime, called the Goryeo regime, Goryeo or Koryo, is the source of the English word Korea. He was founded by Wangjeon in AD 918. In AD 936, he established his own ruling dynasty named Goryeo, supposedly because of his being a descendant of Goguryeo nobility. Thus he sold the feudal solution to the lords and ladies based on his kingdom being the legitimate successor of Goguryeo. Wangjeon made his hometown Kaesong, in present-day DPRK, the capital, which is also the point where the U.S. and everybody else meets on a regular basis to solve any problems that come up between the North and the South. His regime lasted until AD 1392. Military officers between AD 1170 and 1270 ministered this government for a century. Agricultural peace had improved with the introduction of the new system of legal codes and the relatively honest civil service. Thus, for the moment, across class lines, Koreans enjoyed a relative prosperity. In fact, Korea in the AD 1400s had the highest standard of living in East Asia. However, not all the great landowners and their scholar gentry-dominated agriculture were happy. They didn't like having to put up with the increasingly impertinent, uppity, common farming families, and as if that were not bad enough, they saw that in the towns and cities, the craftspeople were getting to feel their oats, thinking that because of the importance of their skills to the profit-making burghers, they could act out whenever they felt like it. The city and town merchants were formerly looked down upon by the masters and mistresses of the land, and commerce was officially for the greedy and dishonest. The other side of the coin was that the common people in town and country, about 80% of the population, were far from satisfied with their servitude. The fact that the farmers had accepted a temporary peace in their previously internecine rebellions against their masters and mistresses did not change the facts of tenure. Few small farmers owned their own land. Most farmers were still enserfed laborers, having to work for landowners. They were not free to leave the land. They were forced to work without permission from the landlord and from the king. Even though they were the foundation of the nation's food supply, they were treated like shit. Below these serf laborers were the low-born chonmen. This included all of those who did non-agricultural work, such as butchers, grave diggers, leather workers, basket makers, and bark peelers. Formerly lower were the entertainment industry workers, including sorcerers, magicians, prostitutes, and accoutrement support. Slavery was legal for punishment, and prisoners were about a fifth of the population and were enslaved. Buddhism, with the icons of the Gila cult, flourished and spread throughout the peninsula. Buddhism brought with it the idea of acceptance of one's lot in this life for reward in one of many possible destinations down the road in another life, again securing some degree of labor peace. Only the outlaw and ronin classes and their prostitutes saw through the chicanery. Now we come to an interesting subject, the greenware. The development of Celadon pottery flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries AD. Celadon is a term for pottery denoting both wares glazed in the jade green Celadon culture, now referred to as greenware. This ceramic features a type of transparent glaze. The glaze normally has small cracks and was first used on green ceramics but later used on other porcelains. The green color was produced by firing a glaze containing a little iron oxide at a high temperature in a reducing kiln. The materials must be refined, as other chemicals can alter the color completely. Too little iron oxide causes a blue color, which is sometimes the desired effect, and too much gives olive and finally black. The right amount is between 0.75% and 2.5%. The presence of other chemicals may have effects. Titanium dioxide gives a yellowish tinge. Pieces made with a Celadon glaze are themselves often referred to as celadons. Celadon is a European term for the ware originating in Chinese kilns, such as the Longquan kiln in Zhejiang province. Celadon production later spread to Korea, and most of the earlier Longquan Celadon is on the border of stoneware and porcelain, meeting the Chinese but not the European definitions of porcelain. The similarity of the color to jade, traditionally the most highly valued material in East Asia, was a large part of its attraction. And in Korea, the Celadons produced under the feudal Goryeo regime from 918 to 1392 are the type wares of Korean porcelain. Greenware contributed greatly to the trade between Korea and the Islamic caliphates, Japan, and China. Millionaires of the time were made many times over. Yet it was the printing of the Tripitaka Koreana onto 81,258 wooden printing blocks and the invention of the metal movable type that in the long run were the greatest technological accomplishments of Goryeo. In AD 1018, the rulers of the Khitan Empire, which was the most powerful empire of its time, witnessed the great wealth in Goryeo already accumulated and the greater amounts yet to be made via trade, and decided to invade. The Khitan bosses were defeated by Goryean General Gang Gam Chan at the Battle of Kuju. That put an end to Khitan dreams. After defeating the Khitan Empire, Goryeo experienced a golden age that lasted 100 years, during which time the Tripitaka Koreana was completed, and there were great developments in printing and publishing. These promoted learning by spreading knowledge on philosophy, literature, religion, and science. By 1100 AD, there were 12 universities that produced famous scholars and scientists. Now we come to the period of the Mongol intervention. The Mongol Empire occupies Korea. In AD 1231, the Mongol Empire began its invasion of the kingdom of Goryeo. There were 7 campaigns that did not conclude until AD 1270, and these invasions cost a tremendous number of civilian lives throughout the Korean peninsula. Ultimately, Korea became a vassal tributary polity of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, and that status lasted 4 generations, or approximately 80 years. Free at last. In the decade of the AD 1350s, the Mongol Yuan regime in China lost its grip on many foreign lands due to internal struggles that occupied the time and effort of Yuan military might. This enabled Korean King Gongmin to reform the Goryeo government, and Gongmin began by removing pro-Mongol aristocrats and military officials. Landholding was rearranged to favor those loyal to the new boss. Quelling the growing animosity between the Buddhist and Confucian scholars required a firm hand. Even with all this on his plate, Gongmin was able to conquer Liujiang in AD 1356. He then repulsed 2 large invasions by the Red Turbans in AD 1359 and 1360. In AD 1364, he defeated the final attempt by the Yuan to dominate Goryeo when General Zhou Yang defeated an invading Mongol Tumen. During the 1380s, Goryeo turned its attention to the Wokou Ronin pirate menace and used naval artillery created by Cho Museon to annihilate hundreds of pirate ships. Now, the reformed Goryeo regime would last until 1392. The Taizhou of Joseon, the founder of the Joseon Dynasty, took power in a coup in 1388, and after serving as the power behind the throne for 2 monarchs, he established the Joseon Dynasty in 1392, and this brings us to Joseon Feudalism proper. Korea's Joseon Dynasty of monarchs had begun in AD 1392 and was to last until 1864. By 1392, the Koreans learned how to make gunpowder, which had been a guarded secret in China. The Koreans had cannons. They were wearing cotton clothing ahead of the Japanese because they were closer to China. The Koreans had compasses and an observation balloon. Printing with clay type began in China in the AD 1000s, and in the year 1403, Korea advanced printing with the use of metal type. You will recall that copying by hand was still being used in Europe. Under the Korean king Sejong, AD 1418 to 1450, book publishing accelerated. Poetry, fantasy novels, books on philosophy, and medical encyclopedias were published. Sejong created a new academy to promote scholarship, and he had a new phonetic alphabet created with 1 letter for each sound, an advantage over the 50,000 characters used by the Chinese. In the AD 1400s, Koreans were continuing their work in astronomy and meteorology. They developed wind velocity measurement 200 years before this was in use in Europe. To improve farm production, the Koreans were measuring rainfall, and in AD 1492, a book was published entitled Straight Talk on Farming, to aid in the planning of agricultural tasks. This new and improved agriculture created an era of Korean prosperity, at the same time that Japan was spending its energies and wealth in incessant warfare. And this, of course, 1492, is the year of what? Columbus' first attempt to get to the New World. His attempt to get to Japan, Korea, and China, well, he barely made it to the Bahamas. At any rate, Korea in the AD 1400s had the highest standard of living in East Asia, although Korea was burdened by its feudalism. The land was still in the hands of the biggest noble landowners that employed scholar gentry, and officially merchants were viewed as greedy and dishonest, but in reality they ran the towns and cities. A new class of craftspeople worked for them because of their skills. Below the craftspeople in the official order were the common people, about 80% of the population. Most of them worked for landowners and were not free to leave their landlord without permission from the king, even though they were described as the foundation of the nation. The lowest classes were the majority of people who were farm laborers. Technically, in the feudal class system were chomen, butchers, grave diggers, leather workers, basket makers, bark peelers, and those in the entertainment industry, such as sorcerers and magicians. And then there was the fifth of the population who were slaves by virtue of punishment. The slave class in AD 1400 was about 350,000. Under the third Joseon monarch, Taejong, who lived AD 1400 to 1418, China's main rulers gave recognition to Joseon rule. However, they did so with the understanding that Korea was subservient to China. The Joseon monarchs accepted subservience and vassalage. At the beginning of the Joseon Dynasty in AD 1392, what had been a golden age of Buddhism in Korea ended. Confucianism and Buddhism were in conflict in Korea, as they had been in China. The first Joseon monarch, Taejo, removed the power and influence of Buddhist monks from government. He expelled them from the capital, and he confiscated Buddhist estates. The construction of temples in the capital was forbidden, and the amount of land that Buddhist monasteries could own and the number of monks and nuns living in monasteries were regulated by the police. Despite government regulation and disapproval, Buddhism retained much of its popularity among common people, especially among women. Where Confucianism reigned, women had declined in status with an obligation to subservience to their husbands, and after they died, to their eldest son. The ability of women to inherit property was falling, and by the middle 1600s, inheritance had become exclusively for an eldest son. However, Confucianism reigned supreme among Korea's elite. In its Korean form, it held that moral and natural law arose from the supreme ultimate behind the universe. In this mythology, it claimed a spirit controlled the yin and yang of the five elements of existence, those elements being fire, water, wood, metal, and soil. But the ruling class' real interest lay in the Confucianist support for class differences, and this extended in Korea to outlawing marriage between people of different social classes. The elevation of Confucianism over Buddhism did not change the nature of the monarchy, nor of those who would succeed the first Joseon king Taejo. This had to be resolved in bloodshed. Conflict existed, as always in feudal systems, between monarchs and the nobility, and the third Joseon monarch, Taejong, reorganized his bureaucracy in order to strengthen his rule. King Sejong, AD 1418 to 50, reversed the policies of his predecessor by patronizing Buddhism. Accordingly, inter-class war returned in 1453. The boy monarch, Tanjong, was forced to abdicate in favor of his uncle Sejong, 1458 to 1468. Through all of this strife among the rulers, a belief in education prevailed among Korea's elite. Korea had 5 universities for males from noble families, and the rich were getting richer in the form of expansion by agricultural estates at the expense of small farmers. Tenant farmers were oppressively taxed because big landowners forced their workers to pay taxes that they would not, and poor farmers had to borrow at excessively high interest rates. Commoners abandoned farming, leaving their taxes to be paid by their kinsmen and their neighbors in a collective responsibility. And brigandage was on the rise as the dispossessed turned to large-scale piracy and highway robbery. The Imjin War. In 1592, Japan's Hideyoshi began his attempt to conquer China, landing at the Korean port town of Pusan before dawn on April 13th. And it was an early Douglas MacArthur type of landing, and in fact it was MacArthur's West Point education that had made him aware of this military feat. Anyway, Pusan's garrison commander was away hunting game, and resistance to Hideyoshi's army was minuscule. Hideyoshi had no plan to win advantage by liberating Korea's downtrodden. Instead, he used terrorism, as Timur and others had used before, and MacArthur would later. After blasting Pusan with cannon fire and conquering the city, his army massacred unarmed civilians. Hideyoshi favored beheading, killing 30,000 of them. MacArthur favored machine guns and artillery. The Japanese army pushed northward into Korea, massacring more civilians along the way. In 20 days, a spearhead unit of around 20,000 Japanese was at the capital, Hanyang, that is Seoul, which was defended by less than 1,000 men. Korea's King Sanjo escaped to Pyongyang and then to Uiju on the Chinese border. The Japanese reached Pyongyang before rulers of China entered to protect their tribute-paying regime in Korea. They sent 5,000 soldiers against the Japanese at Pyongyang. The Japs were stopped and turned their attention to the money. MacArthur did not and got himself surrounded and wiped out at Chosin Reservoir half a millennia later. At any rate, at this time, the Japanese thought the better part of valor lay in halting their advance and getting down to the business of occupying Korea's rice-producing areas in the southwest, Chongchong and Chola. When I was in intelligence analysis school at Fort Holabird in Baltimore in 1960, it was this ill-fated MacArthur campaign we studied in combat intelligence courses, and as I mentioned in the earlier lecture, I have numerous humorous reflections on the interviews we had with returning vets. Anyway, as usual, the gringos today haven't learned jack shit, and are about to get their ass whipped again off the coast of Korea. King Sanjo sent his messengers through the country to raise a volunteer militia, and Koreans formed guerrilla forces against the Japanese devils. Korea's navy had ironclad ships over 2.5 centuries before the Monitor and Merrimack, and Korean ironclad warships engaged the Jap Navy at the Battle of Hansando, sinking 63 Japanese ships. Britain's Admiral Horatio Nelson and Japan's Admiral Toko would study this battle later on. The 470 remaining ships in Japan's fleet fled to Pusan Harbor. On September 1st, 1592, the Korean Navy inflicted more damage on the Japanese fleet, and Korea's Admiral Joseon Sum-sin acquired control of the seas around Korea. His admiralty allowed Japanese ships to leave, but not enter Korean waters. Accordingly, the Japanese were unable to reinforce or supply their ground forces, and the Japanese army turned to living from plunder, and the war in Korea dragged on for another 6 years. In August 1598, Hideyoshi died. His last request was to have his forces in Korea withdrawn. His successor, Tokugawa Ieyasu, ended the war, withdrawing what he could. This is the man who later became shogun in 1600. At any rate, first of all, he got his troops out of Korea. The 1600s in contact with the West. Japan's invasion left much of Korea in ruin. Japan's invasion left Korea with more land to the benefit of surviving farmers, however, and this was non-slave, relatively free serf labor being used to reclaim and restore the agricultural fields. From early in the AD 1600s, the technique of transplanting rice seedlings improved by growing plants from seeds and then transplanting them to the rice paddies. In AD 1628, Korean first contact with Europe came when a Dutch ship wrecked near Jesu Island. The Koreans rescued 3 of the Dutch crewmen, putting them to work making weapons and helping in military training. In AD 1631, Korean knowledge about Europeans increased via China. An envoy to China had returned with a map of Europe. These envoys were charged with securing Chinese expertise and thus had acquired a musket, a telescope, and alarm clock, as well as books on astronomy and European culture. Korea's rulers' experiences in the war against the Japanese made them conscious of the need for an effective national defense. But before they could improve themselves sufficiently, they were at war with the Manchu Chinese Empire. In AD 1636, Chinese armies crossed the Yalu River, numbering 30,000 troops. Rather than try to destroy the Manchu invaders, the Koreans negotiated. The Manchus claimed that they were brothers of the Koreans and won from the Koreans recognition of their suzerainty over Korea in place of suzerainty over China, the other Chinese regime. The Manchus won from the Koreans a non-aggression pact and an agreement to trade, and in 1637 the Manchus withdrew and pursued their aggressions against their enemies within China, whom they soon conquered. Now we come to the seeds of capitalism blossoming and ascending against the declining tree of feudalism. Now, after AD 1650, interest in Western science increased in Korea. A book by Jean Terence, Descriptions of Ingenious Devices, had made its way to China and then to Korea. Meanwhile, an autochthonous outlook was rising among the Koreans. This was the Shirhak school of scholarship. Its adherents wanted change. They proposed a new land system and equality of opportunity. They advocated replacement of the old civil service examinations with a new system of recruitment, and they wanted a curriculum featuring the study of Korea's history and an emphasis on science, economics, and foreign languages. Now, as for the antagonistic contradictions that were dooming Korean feudalism, tenant farming continued to dominate Korea's agriculture, with slaves laboring on public and military land for some landowners. Big business continued under heavy government regulation. Only petty bourgeois commerce of individual peddlers and rural crafts were free to grow. Laws that kept them bound to their places of work hampered social mobility. Confucian values continued to inhibit economic growth, asserting the nonsense that exchange could be gift-giving rather than motivated by profit. And nonetheless, some growth in Korea's economy could not be stopped. The government continued to sponsor advances in agriculture, and land reclamation projects increased food production by growing rice, barley, buckwheat, beans, ginseng, cotton, and potatoes. Alongside this, Korea was developing a money economy, yet high taxes continued to discourage enterprise. A government tax on mining made mining less profitable, and mines closed, except, of course, those mines that could be secretly run. And labor was antagonistically conflicted. The growth of wage labor in bourgeois endeavors in factory conditions and shipyards had created a new class of proto-proletarians. Accordingly, there were an increasing number of serfs serving as household domestic servants. They received a monthly salary, and furthermore, earnings gained outside regular working hours could supplement these salaries. Out-resident serfs, distantly residing, were little different from tenant farmers among the enserfed commoners. They were registered officially as independent family units and possessed their own houses, families, land, and monies. These out-resident serfs were far more numerous than household serfs. In the Chaquet system, serfs were assigned 2 pieces of agricultural land, with the resulting produce from the first land paid to the master, and the produce from the second land kept by themselves to consume or sell. So serfs could purchase their freedom by earning it through military service, buying it, or receiving it as a favor from the government. The serf population could fluctuate up to as high as a third of the population, but on the average, serfs made up 10% of the total population. The hierarchical relationship between Yangban, master and serf, was to be equivalent to the Confucian hierarchical relationship between ruler and subject, or father and son. Thus, serfs were considered an extension of the master's own body. This analogy came from the Confucian ideology of patronage and mutual obligation. In the annals of King Daejong, it is written that the serf is also a human being like us. Therefore, it is reasonable to treat him generously. And in our country, we love our serfs like a part of our body. The serf system declined beginning in the AD 1700s. Since the outset of the Joseon government at the beginning of 1600s, there had been harsh criticism among prominent thinkers in Korea about the serf system. Even within the Joseon government, there were indications of a shift in attitude toward the serfs. King Yeongjo implemented a policy of gradual emancipation in 1775, at the same time as the revolution in New England was beginning. His successor, King Jeongjo, made many changes that lessened the burden on all serfs, and these included the 1801 emancipation of the vast majority of Korean government serfs. The Korean ruling classes had little choice but to give up feudalism, as more and more serfs were taking to the Ankle Express to anywhere besides here. They followed the now well-beaten track of the Underground Express of escaped slaves from earlier times, and in fact, the growing commercialization of agriculture and the rise of the independent, the small farmer class, meant they could hide in open sight. By 1858, on the eve of the U.S. Civil War, the Korean serf population was only 1.5% of the total. The hereditary serf system was officially abolished in 1886, and the rest of the serf system was abolished with the Gabo Reform of 1894, And that brings us to an end of our discussion of Korean feudalism. In the next lecture, we're going to discuss the capitalist stage in Korea.